And then yesterday, Fox and Friends literally parrots one of the manifesto's talking points verbatim as fact about a so-called Hispanic invasion.
What the president has during his 2.5 years is a major problem at the border, which was not his doing, unless you want to blame President Obama for the unaccompanied minors that streamed through here in 2014. If you talk to people who are apolitical at the border, people want to look at the words infested. We keep marrying other species and other ethnics.
In the hit film The Matrix, a cast of plucky techno-anarchists fight against a system whereby human beings are plugged into a simulated world so that a race of sapient machines can harvest them for energy. In the sequels, the architect of this system reveals that the entire original premise of people awakening from the simulation, fighting against it, and ultimately triumphing was actually part of the system all along, and it had happened before. Our plucky techno-anarchists were uncontrolled rounding errors, people who couldn't be convinced by the simulation, so they were cultivated into a self-correction mechanism. There is a cycle of built-in crisis meant to make the system of enslaving humanity in false consciousness more efficient over time by folding revolutionary movements into the apparatus. Outside the realms of upscale minimalist leather and retrofuturistic sci-fi, this cycle of false crisis has a firm home in the political sphere. Allow me to elaborate. First, oligarchs begin to fund a fifth column in a country whose leadership they disagree with. The US is doing this in multiple countries right now, like Venezuela. Or they orchestrate a coup. The Obama administration recently pulled a hard coup in Ukraine and started a judicial coup in Brazil. Or they start a regime change war. Iraq, Afghanistan, or they fund terrorist organizations to do this. The Reagan Doctrine in Latin America. Or they sanction it into oblivion to get the population to give in. We're currently trying this in Iran. Or they do all of these things, like in Syria. Then the country, once conquered, is forced into debt obligations, Iraq, or unequal trade relations, Burkina Faso, or made an outright colony, unable to act without outside approval, arguably Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. Then the country is essentially strip-mined, like Chile. Everything within it is privatized, and the native population has been driven to economic ruin by the outside interventions, or they were already too poor to afford the assets at market rates. So outside investors essentially purchase the country wholesale. See the Balkans. The population is ushered into foreign-owned sweatshops. More recently, sweatshops that rely on foreign contractors. See the results of the 3 Indochina wars. Then, predictably, people flee the country because of the terrorists, Libya, or the war, Iraq, or the sanctions, Venezuela, or the political oppression of the coup government, Honduras, Ukraine, or just because the new economic regime foisted onto it has driven the country to ruin, like Mexico after NAFTA. Then, the people who orchestrated all this destruction, exploitation, and violence from the beginning fearmonger over the people fleeing it. This justifies never amending the immigration process. Thus, immigrants work for a fraction of the imperialist country's minimum wage. This can be official, like how migrant workers in the EU make the minimum wage of the country they come from, not the country they work in. Or unofficial, like undocumented migrant agricultural workers here in the United States. If things spiral too far out of control, we can just put them all into for-profit cages, where they can be made to work for even less. The oligarchs who pulled the whole thing used the fear and hatred cultivated by the media apparatus they own, or the pundits they buy, to get their preferred ciphers into office, whom they also buy. Whereupon, the climate is destroyed further. The worst drought on instrumental record is actually what sparked the conflict in Syria. More wars are started, more race-to-the-bottom trade agreements are drawn up, see TPP, or Trump's attempt to get the worst aspects of the TPP into the renegotiation of NAFTA. More funding goes to terrorists, or mercenaries like Blackwater. More coups are supported, and more refugees arrive. This is the right-wing crisis cycle. Where are the moderate right-wingers in this? These so-called liberals? Well, in this protracted matrix metaphor, the liberals are the architect. Capital itself would be the machines, I guess, harvesting workers for energy. Reactionaries might be good at spectacles or even campaign tactics, but come on, they're too dumb for this wonky stuff, which leads to the question.
You know why people don't like liberals? Because they lose. If liberals are so smart, how come they lose so damn always? Hey!
Liberals cannot question the premises of any of these things, because all of these things are profitable. $72 billion in profits from the first decade of the Iraq War, and that's just the government contracts. All told, the global north extracts more than $3 trillion net from the global south every year, and those are just 2012 numbers. Our military apparatus is driven by Boeing, Raytheon, ExxonMobil, and Citigroup. The biggest contract printers in Iraq, according to Financial Times, aren't even makers of munitions. Quote, "This is not my grandfather's military-industrial complex," said Dan Gore, vice president of the Lexington Institute, a national security think tank partly funded by defense contractors. "There's not a single munitions producer in this list." End quote. Our security apparatus is driven by Silicon Valley, this blob of public-private partnerships growing around the NSA et al. Arms dealers make money selling the bombs, bankers make money financing the reconstruction. Construction contractors make money rebuilding. Extractors of oil and minerals cash in on the newly privatized loot. Merchant capitalists like Apple and Amazon cash in on the new sweatshop labor and the dirt cheap goods they resell for super profits in the first world. Everybody wins, or at least every first world capitalist does. And the newly minted comprador bourgeoisie in the colony does too, if they're willing to sell out everyone else who lives there. This is why people talk about the Democratic Party as the place grassroots and progressive movements go to die. How many campaign managers, pundits, intellectuals, or even politicians themselves come from an activist background of demanding a whole loaf, only to turn around and accept the Democratic breadcrumbs as they're folded into a prestigious six-figure job on Capitol Hill or in Manhattan? The forms of these radical demands are recuperated. More and more limousine liberals talk the talk using all the right lingo. Right now, it's the lingo of woke capitalism. That's all it is, though. The aesthetic is kept, the content is discarded. This is how the previous set of plucky protagonists is folded into the system, making it even more effective than it was before. A lot of pundits, especially inexplicable Republican best friend types, talk about immigration as being the Great Wall that the left just can't get through, an albatross around the neck of the left. For liberals, who really aren't left-wing at all, this is true enough. They orchestrate all these disasters, and all they can do at the end of it is say, "Oh, no, immigrants aren't the problem. We should be compassionate." So, what is the problem? Is it wage labor and capital? Is it imperialism? They can't make that argument. They have no convincing explanation. So they try to compromise with things like the '94 crime bill or Obama becoming deporter-in-chief. Clinton removed more than 10 million immigrants during his tenure. Obama removed 5 million. Does any Republican ever consider Clinton or Obama to have been strong on immigration? Have you ever heard them say that? This is why the only credible case with regards to immigration and refugee crises comes from the left. Anyone who's not prepared to confront the profit motive meaningfully cannot confront the logic of empire, and imperialism will always lead to crises of displaced populations and refugees. Who is confronting the usurers on Wall Street? The DNC or AOC? Who confronted the World Trade Organization? Unions or corporate media? Who's interrogating the IMF? Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton? Who's willing to rebuke imperial client states, even when it's politically taxing? Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn? Who is standing against Salafism in Saudi Arabia? Donald Trump or Ilhan Omar? Who is trying to destroy US concentration camps? And who is out fear-mongering about Latinos? But I have a confession to make. I'm not fussed about people immigrating here. Why? US capacity utilization is 78%. In the EU, it's 82%. A fifth of our capital isn't even being worked. The first world investment share of the surplus is barely more than 50%. The rest isn't being invested. It's being crammed into tax havens. There's enough food to feed everyone half again as much as they need, but millions are still going to starve. There's more housing than homeless people. What we're facing is an epidemic of nonsense jobs, underinvestment, wars, and overconsumption, especially of fossil fuels and animal products. These are organizational problems. Scarcity is created purposefully to cultivate dependence on the current aristocracy of capitalists, who are perfectly happy to start limitless wars, build a sprawling archipelago of labor camps, and melt the polar ice caps to find and kill God. Don't believe me? When it comes to food, we could switch to a plant-based diet. Quote, a study in The Lancet Planetary Health by Nicole Blackstone and colleagues highlights the environmental footprint of 3 different diets recommended in the 2015-2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans: the Healthy U.S. Style, Healthy Mediterranean Style, and Healthy Vegetarian Dietary Patterns. By assessing 6 categories of environmental impacts: climate change, land use, water depletion, freshwater eutrophication, marine water eutrophication, and particulate matter or respiratory inorganics, they established that the healthy vegetarian diet produced a 42 to 84% lower burden than the other 2 diets for all impacts except water depletion, which was similar between the 3 diets. End quote. We could reduce our land usage by 75%. When it comes to energy, renewables are already competing with fossil fuels on the only level capitalists care about: cost, and renewables are only getting cheaper. Quote, IRENA's Renewable Power Generation Costs in 2017 report predicts that solar costs will fall even further in the next few years, with a further halving of typical costs by 2020. That means onshore wind and solar PV projects could be consistently delivering electricity for as little as 3 cents per kilowatt hour within 2 years. End quote. Compare this to 5 cents to 17 cents for fossil fuels. So don't come for me with any of that Western civilization stuff. You're not defending Plato or Shakespeare. You're defending your limitless supply of bacon cheeseburgers. This isn't about the fatherland, it's about Hummers and people who think that reusable shopping bags are girly and recycling is tedious. Believing in overpopulation and not underdevelopment is a choice. Supporting Build the Wall over the Green New Deal is a choice. Be honest about it, and stop falling into this cycle of manufactured crises. Unfortunately, this rhetoric has another purpose. As there are more political and ecological disasters, we're going to face a choice. Either some kind of policy regime that does not favor the first world, or genocide. The people marching at Charlottesville are some of the first to have recognized this, and their choice is clear. This dehumanization and scapegoating is meant to prepare us emotionally and intellectually for that genocide, just as the cancerous militarization of the police and the expansion of the security state is meant to prepare us for it materially. We can build a meaningful, dignified existence for everyone, but we have to fight for it.